So hopefully people can see all four of our panel members. I'll just introduce our last two panel members from private consultancies. So first up we have Chris Olszack. And Chris is a founder and director of Aither, which is an advisory firm established to help governments and businesses make better decisions about water, infrastructure and the environment. He's led major water management inquiries and reviews for government and regularly presents to irrigator groups on market trends and drivers and oversees Aither's water market advisory services, including the production of their publicly available annual reports, water market reports. And we also have Jeremy Cheesman, and Jeremy is an applied natural resource and environmental economist specialising in environmental economics, investment appraisal, non-market valuation, strategy development, market design and policy design. Jeremy is also a director at Marsden Jacobs Associates and a founding director of the Waterflow Australian Market Information Platform, which which Ben pointed out earlier. And Water Market is free, was developed by Marsden Jacobs Associates and brings together water market information, allowing easy comparisons of water options across the Murray-Darling Basin. So to start off our panel discussion, what I will do is I'll go first to you, Chris, and then to Jeremy. And if you have sort of a 1 to 2 minutes, you've got any comments or reflections on both presentations, and then we'll start to have a look at the questions that are coming through in our Q&A. Over to you, Chris.
Thanks, Jess, and thanks, Erin and Ben, for fantastic presentations. I think they were very complimentary and both really good. I'm coming to you from Wurundjeri land. I'd like to acknowledge their elders, past and present, and pay my respects. Very close to the Merry Creek in Melbourne. So I just wanted to touch on a couple of points, which I guess provide a bit of an overview and commentary on the presentations and support many of the things that have been said. So I first wanted to start with Erin's point around historical factors. So there's a perception that we should go back to how things were, that unbundling has been a disaster and we need to go back to how things were in the 80s or before. I'd guess to start out say that things weren't so good back then. We were irrigating land that wasn't suitable for irrigation. It was creating salinity, waterlogging issues, nutrient issues. There were very low returns from irrigation, inefficient practices, and excessive levels of extraction and no overall caps on the system. So the only thing good about how things were is that it rained more. So we put in place caps. We gave people property rights. We gave them property rights. These are assets that are now worth over $20 billion in the Southern Connected system. And we enabled trade and market forces to flexibly move water around as dictated by individuals, not governments. This was part of a broader suite of economic reforms that said we need to make our economy more flexible and efficient. So let's give individual business owners the power to move their resources around. So in my view, driven enormous benefits. Sure, the spread of impacts has been uneven, but for people to say it's not working, I think is missing a massive story around huge benefits that have been driven by water markets. So I'll fast forward to some of the things that Erin touched on. And in some ways, water markets have actually been a victim of their own success. For the last 5 years or so, I've been harping on about the fundamental changes in water supply and demand that are affecting the market. So what I mean by that is that since markets were created, and even back in the 1980s, water allocation prices went up and down based on prevailing seasonal conditions. When it was wet, the price collapsed. When it's dry, the price went up. But what's happened is that we've had these fundamental changes on the supply side and more recently on the demand side. So firstly, we've had climate change. Many people have seen the recent Kelty inquiry, which really highlighted up in lights the 50% reduction in Murray system inflows over the last 20 years compared to the 100 years before that. So a huge reduction, which the markets has been able to cope with. On top of that, we've had the Commonwealth purchase for the benefit of the environment about 20 to 30% of the entitlement on issue. So in any terms, that's a huge environmental sustainability program and initiative. And then on the demand side, we've not just had the growth in horticulture, we've also had the shift of cotton into the Murrumbidgee, and we've also had a huge amount of investment by all farmers across industries around making their farms more efficient, more productive, getting greater value out of the water that they do have. So, you know, I think in many ways the market has been a success in dealing with those supply and demand side factors. I think a key question is, what of those future drivers that Erin raised will continue to be important, and how will markets have a role in dealing with those? And I think really the problem that you pointed out was problem 2, Erin, was this one around policy. Like, what are we trying to achieve here in rural Australia? And what are the right tools? We can't expect the market to do everything. There are a range of other government policy interventions, initiatives that we need to think around how to achieve the outcomes that we want. What is the outcome in the first place, as you raise, and how does water markets fit in that? It can't achieve everything. And then, so I think just to touch on transparency very quickly, I think this whole drive around transparency has been a bit of a blame the market, blame brokers, blame governments, and think that the price is going to come down. The price, even if we do all of Ben's great ideas around transparency, is it really going to change the price? Is it going to come back to where it was in the 1980s? No, and that's because these fundamental changes have occurred in the supply and demand dynamics in the system. So I absolutely support and have been a champion of making water markets better, and feel like Ben pretty much nailed the types of things that should be done. But it's not going to change the overwhelming fact that water scarcity is here to stay. We've got a system that helps us deal with it, and yeah, we need to think about what are we trying to achieve and what are the other mechanisms that are needed.
Thanks, Chris. And Jeremy, I'll hand over to you for if you've got any comments on the first 2 presenters, and then we'll dedicate the rest of the time to some questions.
Thanks, Jessica. First, I'll start out by recognising the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I'm speaking from their lands today, and I recognise that rights to the land were never ceded. I'll also start out by saying that I'm loving this conversation. I agree with Chris. You know, the presentations from Erin and Ben really complemented each other, and the points that Chris has made really build on those nicely. So I'd also say the problem is that it creates a wealth of things I could spend 2 or 3 minutes talking about. But I'll start out. I've probably got 3 points that I'll try to make, and I'll try to keep it concise. The first is probably just a bit wide background, some stats, just for people who maybe not don't have them at hand. So in terms of, like, let's just last 12 months, just so people can get a sort of order of magnitude sense of the size of this market. So I pulled some numbers this morning. There have been about in excess of 14,000 trades so far this year. That's since the July 1st. About 12,500 of those are through the allocation market as opposed to the entitlement market. I should also note that that's excluding the $0 trades that Ben was referring to earlier on, that happened for a whole bunch of totally justifiable reasons, but we totally agree with Ben that the extent to which you can make that transparent will improve the market transparency and understanding quite a bit. So 14,000 plus trades. It's a $1.5 billion market, about 600 million so far this year through allocation market. And about 1,300 gig of water traded so far. So that sort of gives you an understanding of the order of magnitude of the market. They're rough figures. Second thing that I'd say is I agree with Ben and Erin's market rainbow story and Chris's market optimist story. I would say that this market is, you know, and I would also say that when I say we, I'm talking about Marsden Jacob, and I consider myself probably the most inexperienced person out of the market team in our group. But I think collectively, you know, we would say that, you know, the market is maturing very rapidly from where it has been. And I would say we're at a point now where we actually, compared to a lot of other markets, especially for the size of the markets that we're dealing with, you remember 14,000 plus trades, it's about 300 trades a day, where we actually have very good price discovery. But it's still an issue of if you know where to find it. So Ben, thank you for giving Waterflow a plug. Waterflow was set up, it is a government funded platform that we set up to help improve market transparency. If you go onto Waterflow now, you can see live for free, full market depth for all the brokers who are participating. You can see live prices, you can see live volumes, and you can also see who has been trading in each one of the markets in the past 24 hours. So Ben was saying there's a gap between what you see in the registry versus what you see versus real live prices. Waterflow fills that gap. So we already have price discovery for the markets that we cover, and we're missing one or two brokers, and we're missing a couple of IIOs, but we're 6 months young and we're hoping to close those gaps. So there is already very good price discovery information that you can get for free. And I would say, Erin, we've done our own studies around how long it takes to trade using Waterflow, and it's less than an hour. So that 8 hours figure is down to an hour if you know where to go, even if you're a private irrigator. So market transparency is actually pretty good. There's a whole bunch of stuff that both Ben and Erin talked about that we vigorously agree needs to be cleaned up, and I would expect that the ACCC is looking at a bunch of that stuff. I think the other thing, the final point is, you know, this issue around mixing up the market with a whole bunch of other policy and regulatory issues. And this is something that everybody has spoken about, and Chris was talking about then as well. And, you know, I fundamentally agree with what people are saying. I think we need to be, when we're thinking through problems, these things all work together, but at the same time, we need to be saying, if we're thinking about, for example, TO or traditional owners' rights, is this an issue with the market, or is this an issue with the property entitlement, you know, the entitlement and planning frameworks, and the fact that we haven't received proper allocations? Is it a problem with the fact that cultural and social water can't be traded when you've got people in Indigenous, you know, First Owner nations who want to be trading water? So it's around the specification of entitlements, the absence of allocation that, you know, is completely unjustified in my opinion, but will be hopefully remedied, and Victorian governments and others are working on it. I would argue it's not a problem with the market. It's that's separate from the market. The other thing that I would say is we you know, Chris is talking about things he harks on about. We often hark on about market transparency versus individual transparency. And I think there's a bit of a conflation of those two issues at the moment. So when we talk about market transparency, we talk about price discovery. You can see market depth, you can see who's trading through the broker platforms and stuff, but you can't actually see the individuals who are trading. And so you can't discover their trading intentions. And we would, you know, at the moment we're having discussions with, for example, in Victoria around should we be able to see, you know, who's trading water, how much they hold, and basically have all of your laundry out. And we think for a discussion of market transparency, those two things should sit separately. You know, so when we talk about market transparency, think about price discovery, your ability to be able to trade efficiently at low cost and with confidence. That's a very separate issue from who's doing the trading. But I think at the moment, there's a lot of heat in the discussion around individual transparency, and maybe some of the heat could be taken out by separating it. And then the last point is that, I wouldn't be a good economist if I didn't point this out, but I think one of the things we have to think about always is cost. So with a lot of these solutions to improve market transparency, there are arguments that we should be fundamentally restructuring, you know, registries and a whole bunch of other stuff. That all comes at a cost. ACCC or nobody at this point has done an analysis of what it would cost to bring all of these, let's say, bring all of these registries into a single registry, have a unified platform, but ultimately the people participating in those markets should pay that price. So the fundamental question for me is, how much are you willing to pay for more market transparency? Because ultimately, if you are the beneficiary of increased transparency, you should be the one paying for it. And so we should be asking market participants, are you willing for your trade prices to triple, quadruple? And if the answer is no, then we start to set some efficient bounds on what the level of transparency and regulation should be, and that hasn't been done yet.
Thanks, Jeremy. Now I'd like to turn to a couple of questions. I'm going to combine a couple. There's been a little bit of focus both in the question we had pre the webinar, as well as a couple that have come through in the Q&A relating to Aboriginal water rights, and especially touching on your presentation there, Erin, and noting that you had Aboriginal Australians own less than 0.1% of water within the system. And just some questions around what mechanisms do you see as options to reallocate water to Aboriginal Australians? There's a lot of talk about, how can there be a greater integration of Indigenous water rights, and how can this be achieved within the market system? So I'll throw to you first, Erin, and then we'll see how we're going for time, and we'll probably throw to somebody else.
All right, so I think, look, this is a really big question. I think the pathways towards Aboriginal water ownership or recognition of water rights that were never ceded need to be understood at a number of different levels. So in Victoria right now, there is a treaty process underway. So some of this conversation needs to happen at that level, because I think there is a global discussion of how do we hand over like substantive quantities of water to recognise the fact that they never ceded those rights in the first place. So there's that. There's also a question of how do Aboriginal people actually participate in water management. So traditional owners around the country have a very strong obligation and responsibility to care for country. So how do we enable them to actually deliver on their responsibility to do that? And yeah, that's again a bit outside of the market, but it intersects with the rules that we set for how markets operate. I think the final way into that conversation is to think, well, how can, within the system that we currently have, how do we reallocate water to traditional owners? Now, there are a few small buckets of unallocated water still floating around, where there's water sitting below the cap for a particular region. So that is almost an immediate kind of straightforward duh moment, right? Like, let's just hand over what's not already allocated. Markets do play a really important role because they are a vehicle for reallocation of water. So much like has been done with the environment, there is the opportunity to go to the water market and buy water on behalf of Aboriginal people. So the Commonwealth Government has already committed $40 million to doing just that. That is a tiny drop in the bucket. And every day that goes past without them spending that money, they can buy less water for that money. So I would encourage them to buy water quickly if they at all possibly can. There's a process in Victoria underway that is also looking at how do we actually, how do we use the water market as an apolitical way of facilitating that transfer? And I think it sets up quite different questions to what has happened with the discussion around environmental water recovery. Traditional owners will use water for lots of different purposes, caring for country, but also economic development. So it's quite a different scenario. There is fairly widespread support for reallocating water to traditional owners. So Sue Jackson and others did a survey, I think at the end of last year, that uncovered very high levels of support, sort of around 70 to 80% of irrigator support in regional Australia for water recovery for Aboriginal people. So there's lots of ways into that conversation. All of those ways are really important. But the fact that there are multiple ways doesn't mean that we shouldn't start doing some of the easier and more straightforward ways right now. And the market is one way of looking at that.
Thanks, Erin. And Ben, I'll throw to you. So just based on Erin's comment there, that there was a very high sort of 70% support among rural irrigators for reallocation of water, or for different mechanisms to increase Aboriginal water rights of water. Would you say, I mean, you've got your finger on the pulse working in the broker space, would that be what you get as a general feel in the conversations with your clients?
It's not really a topic of conversation, but it's not something that really has come up with in terms of conversations with the clients. but they're all very focused on their day-to-day business decisions. But one point, Erin, is that the entitlement market's actually dropped in the last 3 months. So there's at least some positive there for traditional owners.
I'll just add to that very, very quickly. Whilst there's obviously some challenges in fully allocated systems, as Erin said, but there's a huge number of water systems all over Australia, particularly over Northern Australia, which aren't fully allocated. And so there is a very easy or a much easier way of allocating water in advance to Indigenous people before the scarcity value and the competition for the resource increases. So there's a huge opportunity in that regard, and work has been done on that, but I think it's just worth pointing out.
Jeremy, did you have anything that you'd like to quickly add to that conversation?
No, I think it's really well covered. Probably the only other thing that I would add is that the Seftons, the independent review that Ben pointed to, actually put out a briefing paper on First Nations water rights and issues, and we were fortunate enough to prepare that with Mildred and a bunch of other stakeholders. So that gives a pretty, all of those things are pretty short and concise, but if people want more information, that's one source, and Erin has written extensively on this and others as well. So.
Thanks. So Chris, I'm just going to a question that's come in from the audience. So talking about government interventions and around good policy to reduce the extent of water intensive crops, just as cotton. I guess the first part is, depending on how you want to approach this, do you think that there need to be policy interventions to reduce the extent of water intensive crops? And then do you think, some examples of potential policy options to achieve that?
Yeah, so when I was talking about other government interventions, I was really talking around social policy, regional development initiatives and other things that might help get the community outcomes and manage some of those community issues. So, I don't support water intensive requirement or regulation, sorry. I'm just not sure what need that will do or what benefit you'll get from that. What we see is that caps are the most important thing to have in place within systems, and then individual irrigators should be allowed to choose which crops are going to work best within their system. We actually do have water use regulations on land, so you can't irrigate without your land being assessed as suitable for irrigation and you having a water use license, which actually does set limits on how many megalitres per hectare are appropriate for this area. So new horticulture, particularly in the Sunraysia, those irrigation development guidelines are extensive, and they're about managing, in relation to water use on land, they're about managing things like salinity and waterlogging impacts. And we should be really thinking about, well, what are we actually trying to achieve by setting those limits on water intensity? And to me, it should be around the third-party impacts on the environment, not trying to dictate, how much is enough for each crop type. The market signal actually means that people are very conscious of how much water they apply, and this is where we've seen huge benefits and huge changes in people investing in on-farm technology to make their water use more efficient.
I'm just going to add a quick comment to that if I can, just to touch on two things that I think are really important as part of that conversation. The first is compliance and enforcement. So making sure that people are only using the water that they're entitled to and doing it when they're entitled to take it is a really big part of managing water intensive use. I think I'm with Chris. I don't want to dictate what a particular grower should be doing on their land. But we need to make sure that they are still following the rules, particularly when it comes to how much water they're actually allowed to use. I think the other element of this conversation, which gets back to that efficiency point I raised about the long-term, short-term efficiency question, is that some water-intensive crops are also annual crops, and keeping annual crops in the mix with the market gives us flexibility to respond in really scarce dry years, because annual croppers will find it easier to sell their water on the market than permanent plantation growers. So I think there is a there's a question here about what kind of mix of crops we actually need, even if it shouldn't be government telling people what specific crop someone should be growing.
Thanks, Erin. Ben, did you have anything that you'd like to add?
No, look, I agree entirely with both Chris and Erin's comments there. The mix of crops is incredibly important, and we've seen that in very stark example over the course of particularly the last 18 months, and we're seeing them come back into the market now with allocation prices lower and one of the best starts to autumn and winter that we've had for a long time. So, but also, to further to Chris's comments as well, it'd be difficult to say, okay, we've established this market and we're going to let the market determine where the water should go, i.e. to its highest value use, and then turn around and say, yes, but we only want X grown here or Y grown there. You can't have your cake and eat it too. And as Chris said, there is already limits there around water use limits on farm to control what's put out.
Thanks, Ben. And Erin, there's just a question relating to your presentation. So in the context of your comments that water rights are not quite the same as property rights, do you see there being a right of compensation if the characteristics of water rights are changed, or how would you see potential for addressing this issue?
So this is it's a really big question, I think, in Australia right now. In 2010, this issue went all the way to the High Court and basically came back largely unresolved. So in law, we do not treat water rights as property. So the rules that govern compensation in the way that, say, if your land was compulsorily acquired or your access to land was changed, there are laws that govern the principles by which you'd be compensated for that. So we don't have something similar to that for water. But what we do have is governments at really every level, from national down through the states, who treat water as though it is a form of property. So anything that does change your water rights is likely to come with some form of government, if not compensation, something to make that change a little bit easier. So one of the reasons why we've seen environmental water recovery proceed in the way it has, firstly by the purchase from willing sellers, that's a fairly direct kind of compensation if you're paying someone for the water that they're choosing to sell to you. And then the other way is through investing in water efficiency programs. So again, it's seen as a little bit of a quid pro quo. So it's, we don't have a formal compensation arrangement, but that gives us more flexibility in Australia. So I think all governments are very committed to respecting their water entitlement frameworks and respecting them as the foundation of the market and of the way that we manage water. But there is just a little bit of flexibility there that means that we can tailor those solutions to meet the problem when we do have to change those conditions.
Thanks so much, Erin. And Jeremy, I saw you nodding furiously through that. Did you have any comment that you'd like noting? I've probably got about a minute, and then I'm just going to sort of flip over to let people know what our next July event is.
No, nothing further, just nodding vigorously in agreement. So.
Fantastic. So thank you very much. Really appreciate all four of you joining us today. It's such a big topic and so hard to obviously fit such wide-ranging questions and material into an hour and a half. Thank you to our audience for joining us. As noted earlier by Janice, the questions that you've sent through, we will work to answer those and send comments out or send response out to those people who have registered. And just bear with me for 1 second while I share our, hopefully you can see that. I just want to also let you know we've got another webinar coming up in July, and it's going to be on data visualization and analytics water management. Can you imagine? So we're still working on a date and the speakers, but we will send that through once we have finalised dates. So thank you very much, everybody. We really value you joining us today.